Meeting of the Public Service Board Select Committee. My name is Jane Pratt and I'm the Councillor for Llanelli, Gilwern and Clydach, and I'm also Chair of the Stronger Community Select Committee. I think if we can all introduce ourselves and if we could introduce the officers first.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Nicola Perry, Democratic Services.
Good morning, Sharon Lloyd. I'm the Communities and Partnerships Development Manager for Monmouthshire Council.
Charlotte Drury, Service Manager in Children's Services here in Monmouthshire.
Good morning, Richard Blakemore, Chief Inspector, Gwent Police.
Pardon, Chairman. I'm Councillor Val Smith, Llanbaddock Ward, and I'm representing Debbie, who's the chairman of your which select committee? Adults, I beg your pardon. So, thank you, Chairman.
Borodar, I'm Martin Grokert. I'm the member for Lansdowne in Abergavenny, and I chair the Children and Young People Select Committee.
Good morning, I'm Jamie Trahan, member for Overmonnow, and I'm a member of this committee.
Good morning, Richard Jones, Performance Manager here at Monmouthshire County Council.
I'm Hazel Clatworthy and I'm the Council's Sustainability Policy Officer.
Thank you all very much indeed, and if I could just remind you to use the red buttons when you speak. We've got a slight problem with the camera on this side of the auditorium, so we may have to move officers along here. Can we just test it? If you, I'm
quite comfortable being anonymous.
Would you like to just test it? If you could just press yours and see if the camera comes to you.
I've pressed the button, so the lights are in red, so it should be coming on me, I guess.
No. Oh, yeah. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed. So, first of all, if we could take apologies for absence, please.
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from County Councillor Pavia, Blakeborough, Howard and Feakins.
Thank you very much indeed. Are there any declarations of interest? And fourthly, are there any members of the public here to address the meeting? There aren't any members of the public. So we'll move on to item number 5. Yeah, we've decided in our pre-meeting that we're going to slightly adjust the agenda with the members' agreement, and we're going to take adverse childhood experiences first, and then we'll take agenda item number 5 after that. So we're just switching around 5 and 6. So if we could have the officers that are presenting the adverse childhood experiences agenda item, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, all. The paper that you have in front of you has been drafted to give the committee an update with relation to one of the steps in the in our wellbeing plan for Monmouthshire Council. This step relates to the objective of children and young people having the best possible start in life, and it's really an overview of some of the work that we've been looking at, and particularly the PSB Programme Board with wider partners, in terms of exploring how we can tackle or mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. So obviously the Act is telling us to look at the long term, to look at the prevention, but also to be collaborative around how we are addressing some of these challenges. And there has been some work to date, most recently last Monday, in the last week or so, that we've held a workshop with colleagues, my colleagues here today with me who are leading and supporting the step around adverse childhood experiences. We'll go into more detail about that as we progress through this morning. And this work now has begun to inform how we address and how we approach the subject around adverse childhood experiences. What we've asked the committee to do today and the recommendations that we've put forward is for members here to scrutinise that there's been enough progress in relation to the wellbeing step of tackling the causes of ACEs and the perpetuation of generational problems in families, to scrutinise the approach taken to develop this wellbeing step and the draft action plan which is attached, and then also to scrutinise if the draft actions are the right actions for PSB to begin to explore the complex issue of tackling adverse childhood experiences. As we say, there is a draft action plan attached to this report, but we would just like to emphasise with the committee that these are draft actions. It's not all-encompassing, but it does give us a starting point with a very complex issue that we're trying to tackle here in Monmouthshire. My colleagues that are here today, Richard Blakemore is our lead for this step on the PSB programme board, and Charlotte has been supporting this work going forward as well. But I'll pass over to my colleagues now, Chair, if that's okay, to give you some information around how we've developed this step. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Just to bring you up to speed then with exactly where we are in terms of addressing this step. As Sharon's explained, I'm the step lead. And as the lead, obviously, I'd just like to point out, and I know that you're probably aware of this, but it's an extremely challenging step to look to address with the complexities that involve ACEs. So in order to try and address that challenge, there was a need to pull together a workshop. We were supported with that workshop with the All Wales ACEs team, who actually hosted it for us, because obviously they're the experts and we were keen to draw upon their expertise to focus everybody's mind and get everybody thinking along the correct lines as to what each member of the programme board could actually do to achieve this step and the goal of the step within Monmouthshire. So part of the day where we've got, if you look at page 5, you'll see there's a diagram where everybody was encouraged to embrace this way of thinking. Quite a simplistic diagram where you'll see you have policy proofing, alignment, adaptation and amendment, and new activity. And we've got some narrative going along each one of those headings, which was provided to everybody on the day to have a think around how exactly, as a programme board, can we address each of these issues. So as a result of that activity, an analysis was undertaken of literature that everybody contributed to. Quite a simplistic way. It was a way of using spreadsheets, flip charts, in groups. Everybody was sat amongst different tables with people from different areas, so there was a crossover of views, opinions, and understanding of what everybody could achieve. And then there was a consensus around how we could develop the action plan in line with this diagram that you've got here on page 5, and what would be the actions out of the day. So as you move through the action plan, you'll come to the end where everyone's considered policy proofing, alignment, adaptation, amendment, and then we've moved on to new activity. And the new activity there, we've got 6 areas that were really the common themes across all of the agencies that are members of the programme board. And I'll quickly go through these with you. Number 1, identify opportunities for the use of the ACEs materials, including the resilience video, which is a resource that's freely available to every member of the programme board to share amongst their teams and their staff. Consideration of how services and community resources could be deployed to ensure that every child has an available and trusted adult. We felt that this was a really keen area of work to try and achieve, and if we could achieve that, it would make a really big difference. Ensuring new activity considers how it is trauma-informed and how it raises resilience. How does it use what the ACE research tells us to improve outcomes? Again, another important theme. You can see that the impact and the control were high. Point 4, increase education and awareness of ACEs by the rollout of a training programme on ACEs / trauma awareness to all staff, and establish a staff training programme. I can advise you from the police perspective, this workshop was held on the 1st, and from the 1st, across all police officers in Gwent Police, there's a training programme and a raising of awareness around ACEs in particular, which is being driven and led forward by the Assistant Chief Constable. So that's where we're at from the police perspective, and I'm sure all the other agencies are now considering how they can do the same thing. And finally, number 6, ensuring the right people are involved, including children, young people and families. Who is missing and how do we involve them? And this was a discussion where education actually came up with this, I think I'm correct in saying, and it was raised that it was important to have children who actually have a say in how we could all make a difference. So it was looking at ways of actually involving young people in these conversations and in these programs moving forward. So that is a summary of the workshop. It was a really useful day. Everybody's now it really took over the whole program board event that day. It was the sole thing for the morning. It was a 4-hour workshop, and everyone now has got the challenge of going away and seeing how they can embed and look at the diagram that you've got here within their own world of business. Charlotte's been instrumental in all of this work. She's certainly somebody that I lean on, as well as Sharon, in terms of getting this done, so I'm very grateful to them. And if you ask me any questions, I'll be leaning on them again. So please feel free. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So are we having another contribution? Should we take questions at the end once we've had all the presentations? Yes, certainly.
Just to give members an idea as well, as Richie has stated, that the workshop that we had did involve the PSB programme board members, but it was also inclusive of wider partners who had a role to play in this. So there was, I think there was about approximately 33 people who attended on that day from various agencies. So we did have education, we had inclusion reps, we had social care there. We've also had a wide range of partners who we felt had a contribution to make towards this agenda. But also the workshop on the day was challenging them to think about the systems that we have currently and how that operates, and also to challenge our way of thinking about the systems that potentially create some of the issues that we're trying to deal with when we're exploring adverse childhood experiences. And I'm sure my colleague to my left will talk more eloquently about some of that. And I'll pass it on to Charlotte, if that's okay, Chair.
I think what was the reason that we... Right, the point of the workshop really was to try and unpick the complexity of the ACE agenda. Because as soon as you start thinking about ACEs, for a start, there are 10 of them. So if the step is to look at how we reduce ACEs, that's a massively complex area. If you just take one of the ACEs, parental incarceration, and you start thinking about, well, what leads to parental incarceration? Well, sometimes that's drugs. Well, what leads to people taking drugs? Well, sometimes that's poor mental health. Well, what leads to people having poor mental health? Well, sometimes that's drugs, and sometimes that's homelessness, and sometimes that's... and very often these are linked back and loop back to adverse childhood experiences. So children having a very poor foundation on which to draw, then going on to form adult relationships and having children of their own, and having very few resources on which to draw to parent them in a way that gives them the stability that those children need in order to grow up and have children of their own and enable them to provide a secure base and a stable foundation for those children. So all of these issues are highly interrelated, and you touch any one of them and there's a ripple impact on lots and lots of others. So we were talking earlier, for example, about the impact of housing on mental health, on emotional well-being, on stability and security for adults, and educational placements for children. So what the research tells us is that children who are in a stable educational placement are much more likely to have a stable home placement wherever that happens to be. So if they're an adoptive placement, that adoptive placement is more likely to be maintained as a stable adoptive placement. If it's a stable foster placement, it's more likely to remain a stable foster placement. If they're at home, they're much more likely. The tipping point for children coming into care is often triggered by a child being excluded from school. And it's a similar issue. The education is maps across for housing for adults. The homelessness can often be a trigger into a spiral of chaos and extreme difficulty over an extended period of time for families. So if we need to find a way. The problem with ACEs is that when you look at it like that, you begin to feel overwhelmed because it's so complex and it impacts massively on so many factors in children and young people's lives. So if we are to map a way forward that's meaningful and actually drives change, rather than us rushing around like headless chickens making everything a priority, which means that nothing then becomes a priority, we need to find a way of organising our thinking and identifying the focuses of action for the PSB. So the model on page 5 was simply a way of trying to get people to organise their thinking. What are they going to do at each of those levels when they're thinking about policy proofing for ACEs, when they're thinking about, are we going to I manage a range of services across children's services. Some of that is sits within the statutory field, some of it is non-statutory. So I'm responsible for developing and delivering a new Edge of Care service, which is a service that is designed to go in and work intensively with families, either where children are currently in care, but we think they can be rehabilitated home safely, or where they are on the cusp of care, where things are going badly wrong, and we think that the trajectory is that those children will come into the looked after system unless something significant changes. That's a service that it's new activity. It needs to be trauma informed and ACE informed if it's to be most effective. So it's really about breaking down what we're doing across the PSB, across those partners from a partnership perspective, looking at where the most effective points of influence can be in terms of addressing ACEs, because we can't do everything. We can't spread the jam too thinly, which means that we need to really look at those points of influence that will have the biggest impact. And I think we also need to capture this idea that if we do some things well, they will then have a ripple effect in terms of impacting on other things. If, for example, we were able to keep every child in a secure educational placement, and we have, I think, a very good pupil referral service in Monmouthshire. We've got a lot of services, I think, that are working very effectively. There are support services that might sit around that, some of which don't exist. Some could be reconfigured to support that better. But I think that would go a long way, for example, to addressing a lot of creating that secure base for children that would enable the mitigation of ACEs. And I think one of the points that was made at the workshop was we're looking at how we mitigate the impact of ACEs. Don't we need to be looking at how we address the root cause of ACEs? Well, very often the root cause of ACEs are the fact that parents are ACE experienced themselves. So mitigating the impact of ACEs, as well as seeking to reduce the numbers of ACEs that children are exposed to, will also, in the longer term, reduce the number of ACEs that children experience, if that makes sense. I'll shut up now.
Just to add, in addition to that, the work plan that we've developed there, so the draft action plan that will be going to PSB after, obviously, it's come here for your critique on that. It is a starting point. It was very much about the systems, as we explained. The people who attended the workshop were people who are in control of the systems that we're looking at and we're exploring. So on the end of this paper that's been submitted to you, you will see that there's a systems map, which is a lot of the boxes with the lines drawn to each of them. And that's the kind of thing that organisations were asked to explore on the day. So the things that Charlotte has said there, things that we as organisations and people who were involved in that workshop have control over, and understanding how we can look at adapting, amending, aligning, or potentially having to create new activity in the worlds that these public bodies have the control over and where they can influence what we do around ACEs. So it's not a fait accompli. This will then have to go into PSB. The intention is that this will have to be refined further, and that will obviously then, as we've put in each one of the steps under A, B, C and D, you will see, as Richie has spoken earlier about, ensuring the right people are involved, including children, young people in this as well. So this was a starting point for those organisations, and the work will now continue to involve more partners in this as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for describing what happened at the workshop and what your focuses are. And I think we're all so concerned about breaking this cyclical behaviour. And I watched the film. I've had flu over the weekend, and I watched the film Angela's Ashes. And I don't know whether anybody else has seen that film, but it is quite horrendous. And it's set in the 1930s, and none of us want to think that children are still experiencing those type of things, but sadly they are. And we know the knock-on effect in our prisons, and also the fact that we're very aware in Monmouthshire that although we're doing very well educationally, there's a cohort of children that are not achieving. So I know that the members have got some very good questions for you. So if I can ask Councillor Grocott first.
Thank you, Chair. It's where to begin, I think. And I am aware that as this is a scrutiny committee, I will try to put some questions into my comments for you to be able to respond. But you might find them quite hard to find, but I'll do my best. I like to think of myself as an optimist, but I am married to a very profound woman who actually defined optimism as the triumph of hope over reality. And I think that when you come to look at much of this legislation, I fear that what we might have is the triumph of hope over reality, particularly because although the Act only applies to Wales, we have to look at resourcing in a national context, I think. And it seems to me that all of the agencies that are contributing towards making a go of the legislation are really struggling to make ends meet. We've seen only yesterday Monmouthshire again having to cut, a reduction of 1% in next year's budget. We've seen the really dramatic impact of cuts on the police service. We've seen the health service in crisis over the winter and promises that the government will do something about it at some point in the future. And as I know most about Monmouthshire County Council, I suppose, as a councillor, I think it's an absolute miracle that sometimes we keep services going. And in the light of yesterday's announcement about a further devastating cut in the money that we get from government, how that is going to get even worse. So that's where I start looking at the enormity of something like adverse childhood experiences. And I just wonder where we begin to address that. And if I could turn it on its head, and using the document that was produced from the workshop, and looking at the impact of ACEs. And they are listed as multiple health issues, young offending, homelessness, low academic achievement, health-harming behaviours, no breaks in toxic stress, and an inability to communicate, sustain jobs, and functional roles. And then when I look at the well-being objectives and how we go in to measure how effective we are, there are two measures. The first is the percentage of underweight births, which ties directly to poverty. Not to anything else, well, perhaps superficially to other things, but it seems to me the overwhelming cause is poverty. And the second thing by which we're going to measure our progress there, and I don't know how we're going to start to address the poverty of some of our communities. It's beyond Monmouthshire County Council, and I suspect beyond the other agencies that we collaborate with. The other measure to judge our effectiveness is to measure the percentage of adult drinking above the guidelines. Well, guidelines are 14 units of alcohol a week. which is a large glass of wine a day. And I suspect many of the middle-class residents of Monmouthshire might well, according to how you're going to measure ACEs here, be falling foul of those guidelines. So it seems to me we're floundering, we're searching around. When you look at the second one, and I'm only going to mention two, don't worry, I'm not going to go through the whole lot, but the second one, tackling physical inactivity and obesity. And again, there we are going to measure our success there by looking at the percentage of people who don't smoke, have a healthy weight, and eat 5 pieces of fruit and vegetables a day. It seems to me, again, there is a huge direct link between poverty and the lives that people lead on a day-to-day basis and their ability to be able to get together to go and buy enough fresh fruit and vegetables, even if they can afford it. And for example, it's a well-known link, isn't it, between the percentage of people who smoke heavily and their socio-economic background. This is what I mean by I'm beginning to feel overwhelmed by the size of the task. And I think that side by side with the sterling efforts of officers in all the partner agencies, we really need to look nationally at where we're going as a country and as a whole nation, not just the Welsh nation, but the United Kingdom. And please, I'm not being party political in saying this, but the harsh reality is that the money that the public sector has got to deliver public service has been decimated. And I worry that it's local agencies like yourselves who will come along and try to implement legislation that in effect it is impossible to implement because there are simply not the resources. And year on year, those resources are getting less. Now, that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to talk politics. That's a reality.
Okay.
And I just worry that where we're trying to break into these targets that we are setting ourselves to address our objectives, how are we going to have the staff to do it? How are we going to have the resources to do it when they are being cut year on year? And how are we going to effectively measure? How are we, as elected members of this council, going to hold you to account in a scrutiny committee for measuring things that you have not got a cat's chance in hell of delivering? So that's pretty strong stuff, I get. But I feel immense frustration that I can see how we could break into that cycle of poverty, but I don't know that we, for 1 second, going to be able to break in unless we get dramatically more resource to do it. Okay. And before I finish, I would just finally ask about the workshop on Monday, because in my role as chair of Children and Young People, and as a former professional with many years of working with young people who have ACEs and are suffering the consequences of that, I was not invited where the Mayor of Abergavenny, bless her, was. And I just wonder if you're actually looking to make the most of the expertise that might help you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Grocott. And I think that it's, important that today we and you make some very valuable points, but I think we must obviously try to stick to what's in front of us here, which is the adverse childhood experiences and how we're going to improve that. But I think you basically make 2 points. You're concerned about the measures of performance and how we're going to fund this work. So I think if the officers at the front would like to address those 2 issues. And I think we also have to accept that this is a starting point. I mean, all the officers made that case that this isn't by any means the end result here, but it's just a starting point. But if you could respond to Councillor Grocut's comments, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Grocut. As you said, there are some real challenges in this work. As we've talked about in the paper, these are, as we've termed them, wicked issues to deal with. They're things that I think, they're not new to public bodies. I think public bodies have been grappling with these issues, and we've been working as partners, individually, as organisations, trying to deal with what comes as a result of adverse childhood experiences. Some of it is poverty driven, although ACES does touch on families who are not necessarily living in poverty, but they do have the means to mitigate it much easier than potentially families that do live in poverty. So in terms of your question about the measures, we are picking measures up in the next paper. So the ones that you've referred to there are the national indicators. We don't have the measures for the activity with ACES as yet. That will develop in terms of the action that is agreed by PSB that we will be taking, and then how we look to measure and wrap the performance framework around that work to ensure that we have the data, the analysis and the information to bring back to this committee so you can actually look at the progress we're making in relation to this. It is a very much a draft action plan at the moment. It's a starting point, as you rightly said, in a massive agenda, a hugely complex area of work. We've tried very much with the idea in mind of how do we fund this work, how do we resource this work, to look at the things within the control of some of those public bodies around how can we change our policies to adapt to some of this work, to address the issues and the challenges that we know around the ACES agenda. What do we need to do in terms of aligning the work so we're all coming at this from the same perspective and travelling in the same direction as public bodies? What are the things that we potentially maybe need to amend? So things that are not necessarily cost attached to them, but things that as public organisations are within our control that we can actually do to start to think and have ACES at the forefront of what we're trying to drive as a county. The new work in particular could be resource intensive in some areas. We need to explore how that could work in practice. But I do think this is something that if we are being true to the legislation, these are some of the challenges that at PSB level, that us as public bodies, we will have to look at what are the things that we can do, what are the things we potentially may have to stop doing to be able to do them, and looking at how those interdependencies play out in that work going forward, because none of this is attached to any money, unfortunately, as you rightly say. So there is no additional resource to any of this work. But I think it's about challenging us to look at how we work differently and how we can collaborate more effectively to do the things that are within our control. Is there anything else the officers like to add? Yeah.
I would agree. I would offer you a little couple of fragments of hope in relation to this. One is the story of a child who was picking up. There were hundreds of starfish. You may have heard this story. Swept up on the beach, and he was putting them back in the sea. And somebody said, "What's the point of doing that?" And he said, "Well, it'll make a difference to the ones that I save." So I think it's always worth holding, particularly when you're working in the public sector. We are never going to be able to do everything for everybody in the way that we would like to, particularly in this economic climate, and we sit within a wider political climate as well as our own political climate here in Monmouthshire. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to do the absolute best that we can within the resources that we have. And I think there is a moral and financial imperative to absolutely do that. And the model that's set out is a way of simply trying to organise people's thinking into what are the things that we have to do anyway. How can we do those things in the best possible way, which means that they will mitigate the impact of ACES, because ultimately there is a financial imperative to do that as well as a profound moral imperative to do that. So I would take your point, but I would offer that in part in collaboration with that. The other point I would make is that we do love a number, and I have a little bit of resistance sometimes because I think, as Einstein said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. But we do tend to focus on the things that are easy to count, and very often those are not the things. The things that really matter are very, very difficult to quantify. So I think sometimes, again, this is an offer back to scrutiny. Hold that thought when you are holding us to account, because some of the things that you really want us to be able to provide you with evidence on, that evidence is going to be necessarily quite soft and quite qualitative. It doesn't mean it's not there. What it does mean is it's difficult to show you in bar charts and graphs that, but a lot of all of the work that I'm doing, for example, on working with families, I'm using distance travel tools that will evidence how families are benefiting and how they are working with us in order to produce positive outcomes.
Thank
I
you.
think, Chair, sorry if I can just add, just to provide you with a little bit of reassurance as well from the workshop the other day. In the face of shrinking resources and budgets, this was really about focusing the mind of every agency that was there. And I think we've achieved that in a small part from that day and given people a lot to think about as they move on. In terms of focusing my own mind, I'm 27 years now into the police service, and I know that on day one, there was nowhere near the focus around child criminal exploitation, sexual exploitation, domestic abuse, and the issues that cause ACEs and that perpetuation that goes on amongst families. And thankfully, 27 years later, it's a sea change in attitude and what we're now seeing as priorities. Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Grocott, did you want to add any further comments?
No, I may...
Thank you. Councillor Chahan, did you have a question that you'd like to ask?
My question really is, it's good to see that there's a draft plan. My concern is the plan put together because there's a need to put the plan together, and is there a real desire between all partners to work together and action on this plan, or is it just because they have to do it through legislation? Because having the plan is one thing and acting on it is another. It's difficult to get everybody to get on the same page, and are they willing to compromise their position to work with everybody else? And if we could have other members of partners here that we could ask this question to, that would be a great help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Chahan. That's a very vital question. So if we could have a response.
Thank you, Councillor Trahan. Absolutely, there is an absolute undisputed willingness from partners to look at how we can come together to tackle these issues. I think obviously having different programme board leads for each of the steps in our wellbeing plan goes some way to show the commitment that officers are willing to look at things which maybe are not necessarily within the control of their organisation per se. So obviously Richard's here today is leading on the ACES step for us as Gwent Police. So much of the work, as Charlotte and Rich have spoken about already, doesn't necessarily sit within control of the police force, but some of the impacts are seen by that organisation. So it's about how can we collaborate, how can we come together, and how can we try to look at how each of the partners can play a role in this. So I do think that there is an absolute willingness to that. The legislative framework that we operate within the Act has meant that for a long time now, as this committee and the previous one before will be aware, there has been a lot of process that we've had to go through, which has been required of us. We are now moving into the stage of developing the action towards that plan. So we do have the plan now, it is in place, and it is now imperative that as officers and as partners that we start to look at how we can translate that into practice. How do we turn that into actual action on the ground? Because we've done a lot of the data analysis, we've done a lot of the consultation, we've come up with sort of the documents and all of the pieces of paper and things that we've shown you and the strategies at this committee. But it's now how do we translate that into actual real action as partners? So it's not as you say, it hasn't been driven by just to get a plan. It's the fact that we are trying now desperately to look at how can we make this plan meaningful and how can we do this differently to the way we've always done it previously.
And I just think, just to add to what Sharon said, it's great. I love a plan, and it's great to have a plan that focuses the mind. I think a lot of people's eyes have been opened in terms of what sits within the ACES agenda, and developing the plan is giving a great steer to everybody as to where we want to go and where we're going to get to.
Did you want to come back at all, Councillor Chauhan? Thank you very much. Councillor Smith.
Very briefly, were all the partners represented at your workshop? All the partners of the Public Service Board, were they all represented there meaningfully?
Yes, I believe that they were. I think you might have kept a head count, Sharon. So if anybody was missing, Sharon would have known, and I'm sure they were all there. Certainly there wasn't anybody that I noticed to be missing, and as Sharon said, there were additions to the day as well, in terms of extra people who were drawn in. So yes, I would say everybody was there.
Just to add, I think in terms of the programme board, the representative from our health board wasn't able to attend that meeting. However, we did have another representative from ABHB who was able to input on that day. So, but other than that, there was full representation from the Public Service Board partners and the also additional officers, as Richie said, that they wanted to include in that day.
Come back, Chairman. So those individuals are all there. They've all had this paper as well. Have they commented on before it goes back to the board in total?
They actually used their scheduled programme board meeting to facilitate the workshop. It was an opportunity whereby we had the commitment of so many of the programme board partners. It was an opportunity to actually build on that session. So this paper hasn't gone back to programme board partners, but this is the information that those programme board partners contributed on that day that has now been framed in this document to come here for yourselves to scrutinise that and to obviously have your critique around the progress that they've made. And then this then will go as a draft to the PSB next week following any comments from this committee.
Because, as you know, I'm a stand-in this morning, Chairman, and hadn't done any preparatory work, but I find it what I've scanned through, I find it useful and constructive, provided, and as you said, numbers, what are numbers? How do you actually know that you've been, things are improving, but the recognition that they're there and the really serious identification of the issues. And also, I think there needs to be an acceptance that the shortcomings of systems and everything, many thousands of people cope with those situations and come out of it okay. It's the ones that can't cope are the ones that you're really looking to identify. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Does anybody want to come back on that particular point? Yeah? Did you want to add anything further? I've got a question I'd like to ask. I think it's very encouraging to see this, and it's encouraging to see that the PSB have got real ownership of this, and it's a real starting point. And for me today, I'm encouraged because, if I'm totally honest, as a new councillor, I struggled a bit at the beginning with how this was all going to work, but there's a lot more meat on the bones for me today. I just want to ask about one particular initiative that I know about from a colleague who's a councillor in Newport, because I think it's very easy for us to dwell on the children that live in poverty, but we've got to remember that adverse childhood experiences go across all social classes and all children. And one of the most terrifying things is a child that has witnessed domestic abuse and then has to go to school in the morning. Now, a colleague of mine, a councillor in Newport who was previously in Plymouth, pioneered a system down in Plymouth with the police force, and it was an idea between them where when a child had suffered domestic abuse, the police officer would then contact the school to let the school know. This has been so successful. I know it's been introduced in the northeast, it's down in the West Country, and I understand it's also being launched in Wales. Are we signed up to this here in Monmouthshire, this scheme?
Not to my knowledge, Chair. I'll certainly find out for you. It's the first that I've been made aware is you bringing that up now. But that's not to say it doesn't happen, because our public protection teams across all of Gwent are always looking at innovative ways. And if there is a councillor in Newport who's raised it already, it should be on the programme really, with the PPU detective inspector. So I'll find out. That's the best I can say really. I'll find out and I'll let you know.
Well, thank you, because in fact she's done so well. She's being presented to royalty over this initiative, so it really has been a fantastic success. And those children, you talked about involving children, and I think that those children that have spoken to and have said, you know, it really was made such a difference that when they went into school, somebody understood what they'd been through. So I know it is being launched in Wales, and I'm a bit concerned that you don't know about it. But, you know, I think these are practical steps that we can take, which helps to mitigate the horrendous effects of some of these experiences. Are there any other comments that anybody would like? Councillor Smith.
Yeah, just linking onto that, Chairman, because I think that's very interesting that the feedback isn't there, because I'm aware within the schools, certain schools, there is a programme which basically electronically records any issue that's associated with a child, and that additional feed-in could account for behaviour that's occurring in the school, but also it's a very good proposal, Chairman, a very good scheme.
Thank you. Well, I think just to sum up, we've had some very important points made here this morning. I think that we are encouraged to see that the PSB are really working together to identify what their objectives are going to be, given that, as Councillor Grocott said, you know, you've got real challenging times as far as funding is concerned, but that, you know, we're looking to make a difference. And also, as Charlotte said, no longer running around like headless chickens, but all working together to really try and make the outcomes better for these young people. So we look forward to having, you know, more information and some more practical information. And I hope you've taken on board some of the comments that were made, especially from, for example, Councillor Grocott brought up the thing about the wine, and I think that although obviously it is an indicator, you know, we're talking about extreme cases here, aren't we? And although any alcohol, and it does frighten me when I see how much alcohol is. I was in Asda yesterday, and I was absolutely horrified by the piles of alcohol and the very cheapness of it. So it is a massive problem. But thank you all very much indeed for coming along to present this to us today. And, you know, it's obviously been time very well spent, and we look forward to having you back to this committee to really tell us, you know, how this is progressing. And we hope that the children get the benefit of these changes, because it really is a massive problem for us. Thank you very much. So we now go back to agenda item 5. I'll just get my agenda. Which is the wellbeing plan, the actions to deliver the vision, agenda item number 5. And if the officers that are presenting this would like to come down to the front, please. So we've got 4 officers. Okay, Sharon and Matt, if you'd like to present this item, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And as I didn't introduce myself for the purposes of the stream earlier, Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance at Monmouthshire County Council. The paper on the agenda here contains a lot of information that should be familiar to members of the committee. As you're aware, in terms of the context, the PSB have approved a wellbeing plan for the county of Monmouthshire. It sets 4 wellbeing objectives, and within that are 19 steps, as the Act suggests we call them, towards delivering those. You've just had an update on one of those steps, that of preventing and mitigating the impact of adverse childhood experiences. The paper before you gives you an overview of that and the other 18 steps. As you're aware, these are all very much a work in progress, and they're at different stages of development. We're addressing complex societal challenges. And as you've heard me say before in this committee, the sorts of things we're looking at wouldn't be in this plan if there were easy solutions to them, if there was existing best or known practice that would have addressed them, because simply we would have applied it and they wouldn't be big problems or issues. They're there because they're not easy to solve. They're intractable challenges. They require analysis. They require new thinking. And thinking about the Act, they require that real long-term thinking and the 5 ways of working, including collaborating across a range of partners. So the paper before you today is to give you a sort of a brief overview on where we're at with those different steps, largely to give you that assurance that it is progressing between meetings, albeit it's not progressing rapidly given the complexity of work involved. And also, as this select committee, to give you the opportunity to identify any of these areas where it's future meetings you would like to prioritise them for scrutiny and invite in partners. Either that's something which has been delivered by Monmouthshire County Council, or as we've seen this morning, being led by one of our partner agencies on the PSB. So, Sharon, I don't know if you want to add anything to that with the Chair's permission.
Yeah, just to add to that, the table that you have in the document there gives you an overview of the vision that's been created for that step, ideally, and then the actions planned and the progress that we're making, and the partner organisation who is leading on that step for us. The steps are, as you can see, we've obviously spoken at length this morning now about the ACES step and how that work is developing to the point where they now have a draft action plan which will structure how we look at that step going forward in more detail. We are then looking similarly at all the other steps, at working with those lead officers, and as Matt has already alluded to, they are at different stages. Officers are each exploring this in their own unique way, so we're not dictating to officers in terms of how they take the work forward around their step. We are challenging them to ensure that it is in line with the policies and the ethos of the legislation, so it has to be collaborative. We need to be looking at the preventative, the long term, etc. So, and how they are developing these steps. The steps are not sitting in isolation of each other, just to give some reassurance to the panel as well, to the committee, sorry, that even though we've explored adverse childhood experiences, as we were saying just now, a lot of that work will touch on mental health, a lot of that work will touch on physical inactivity, a lot of that work will touch on the housing agenda. So the steps will interrelate as this work develops, so they won't, even though they're looking at them potentially in isolation, it will seem, looking at the template, there is joined up work taking place behind this where step leads are being encouraged to collaborate on these steps where they possibly can. So they are developing at each stage. We are working with the programme board officers at the moment to start to develop their thinking and using a framework around some of that, essentially to try and sort of structure their thinking around this. And again, going back to the point around we don't have much resource, there is no additional funding for some of this work, but what does sit within our control are things that we need to be looking at differently and applying a different lens to how bodies, public bodies take this work forward and how we can collaborate to do more with what we have currently. So, and the indicators in there, Matt, I don't know if you want to touch on those.
Yes, it probably talks in part to Councillor Graucout's point in the earlier item. Because these are early stage concepts, and we don't know in some of these exactly what we're doing. It's very hard to identify how to measure them. So what you see in the report, I think it's picked up in para sort of 4.3 or 4.5 of the report, are simply the national measures that are put in place by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that map most closely to that activity. Councillor Graucourt, you're absolutely right. You know, these measures are not going to hit at the nub of the issue there. What we simply try to do, and it's largely, I suppose, a statement of intent, that as these move forward, we're looking to get the best possible measures we can aligned to these. For now, we've just simply slotted in the ones that are there, and you will see that enhanced. And certainly as the ACES work develops, for example, there is a raft of academic research being done in this field, and there will be far more substantial and better aligned measures attached to that as it progresses. But right now we were mindful. We didn't want to be hostages to fortune by speculating as to what those may be, and that's something that will be enhanced in the coming months as the work develops.
Thank you very much. Are you ready to take questions from members? So we are asked to scrutinise these steps here and look at them carefully, and also to think about whether we'd like to have some of these members of the PSB back to this committee in the future. Councillor Graucourt.
Thank you, Chair. I promise I shall be much briefer with this agenda item than I was with the last one. But it's basically around our ability to scrutinise, because my understanding is that this is the only scrutiny of the Public Service Board, so that other agencies won't have an equivalent committee. So there are two questions, really. The first is that, referring to your recommendation, frankly, I think it's a bit mealy-mouthed, and it says that as a committee we may request attendance from any party. It seems to me if we are going to scrutinise on behalf of every agency that contributes to this, we should have rather more authority than we may request somebody to come. Could it be, is that a legislative difficulty, or could we strengthen that recommendation to say that this committee will ask representatives of other agencies to come and explain to us? Because at the moment, the answer that I could give if I worked for health or the police is, thank you, but no, I won't accept your invitation. And then we can't scrutinise. And the second bit is that on its head, if you like. If we scrutinise effectively, is there anything that ensures that other agencies actually take any notice of what we have said and deliberated?
Thank you very much, Councillor Graucourt, but two very important points there, if you'd like to come back.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think actually, as a PSB Select Committee, your role is different to that when you sit in children, young people or adults select committees. There you're scrutinising largely the activities of the local authority and can request others. Actually, in scrutinising the Public Service Board, there is an expectation that other partners of the PSB attend these scrutiny sessions. And to date, we've had no one trying to sort of avoid that invitation. I think the use of the word may is simply my language in terms of saying, not dictating to you as members of the committee what you will do, but you may request their attendance. I'll check back in terms of the legality of the wording within the guidance there, but there is statutory guidance that underpins the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and places a duty on the local authority to scrutinise the PSB. And my understanding is within that duty, you can request attendance of all of those PSB partners. I think the PSB itself, the chair of the PSB, and from a local authority perspective, our reps and that, as you know, are the chief exec and the leader of the council.
Thank you, Matt. I think at this point it might be relevant if I ask Hazel just to remind us of our powers as this Public Service Board Select.
Yes, we've got terms of reference which were not directly lifted from the legislation. We created our own terms of reference, but we do have a guidance note here which has our terms of reference, but it also helpfully gives us some ideas of what role the PSB Select Committee would want to take, but it also includes our actual powers. So in terms of actual powers, the Select Committee has power to review or scrutinise decisions made or actions taken by the PSB, to review or scrutinise the board's governance arrangements, we've done that, to make reports or recommendations to the board regarding its functions or governance arrangements, to consider matters relating to the board as Welsh ministers may refer to it, and to report to Welsh ministers accordingly, and to carry out other functions in relation to the board that are imposed on it by the Act. So it doesn't say specifically that they are required to attend, but it's pretty clear in terms of your reviewing and scrutinising decisions or actions taken by the PSB that they would have to be accountable, and in order to be accountable they would need to be present. So you do have the ability to do that. I think what you're picking up on is perhaps just the wording in the cover report for this item, which was just a general, you may wish to do this, you may wish to think about doing that. So it's just advisory to you to think about who you'd like to call in. And I think you've mentioned in your pre-meeting, and also today Councillor Trahan has mentioned that you'd like to hear from some other partners to ask the same questions as you've heard from partners today. So you might wish to think about which partners you want to ask those questions of. But these are your powers, and I'm quite happy to send this out to members of the committee so that you've got a reminder of your terms of reference. And I think it would be helpful if we include it on all future agendas as well, Chair.
I totally agree, and I think that will keep us focused. Are you happy with that response, Councillor Grocott?
I am, and I wonder if, as a result of it, if we could just change the wording of the second sentence of the recommendations so that instead of it may request attendance, it could say it will ask for the attendance. And that still gives them the opportunity to say, no, we can't make it, we'd love to, but I think it just strengthens it and makes it clearer to other agencies that we are the scrutiny body. And I'd also like a response to the second bit of my question, which was, having scrutinised, are the other agencies bound to take cognizance of what we say?
Yes, so with regards to that, and I guess I was very grateful for Hazel stepping in there as I was desperately searching for the wording of the legislation through several links to provide clarity on that point. So yes, as members of the PSB, the PSB must respond to the comments of the Scrutiny Committee. You have that ability. And it's down to the way in which that group is led then. But everything I've seen around how that public service board operates is the partners are willing to engage. They genuinely recognise these challenges, are open to feedback, because it comes back to this point. We are dealing with a piece of legislation which is new and groundbreaking. We're dealing with challenges that are complex, that impact on all elements of our communities, and it's in all of our interest to use the best of our intelligence and insight to move forward in the best way possible. And I have every confidence that as a committee, as you raise issues, that they will be taken forward by the PSB. And as you know, our representatives on that PSB, being the leader and the chief exec, place us in a very strong position to influence and have our input at that forum.
Okay, Councillor Smith.
Question, Chairman. PSB followed the Local Service Board. Can you give me an example of any decisions that have been made? I've probably been sleeping through. What actual decisions, concrete decisions actually have come from the LSB or the PSB? I've probably slept through something vital, but I really do question, because my idea of the Public Service Board is that it is the bodies that are there to serve the community, actually working cohesively and discussing, making decisions and moving issues forward. And I'm thinking back to sort of last year when there was an issue with the services of the health board in Chepstow. There was absolutely no communication with this council through PSB or whatever. It would have been very good to have been advised of that decision or the thinking of why the service was going to alter so that it could be considered by that body, and everybody considered it. But no, are there any examples of really good decisions, decisive decisions and actions?
Thank you very much, Councillor Smith, and you raised a very important point. And I think, it was brought up at another meeting that we were told that Welsh Government wanted to bring services closer to people's homes, and yet we have decisions which is making people travel a lot further. So I think that's an important point you raise, and if we could have a response to that point that...
To that health issue one, the only reason that was brought before members of this council, and it provoked quite a lot of debate, was the action of an individual councillor here and myself I was aware of, and that was the way members were advised of a really critical decision that was being made, or proposal.
Do we have any examples of where these boards have actually made, changes?
Yeah, if I sort of open up, and I'm sensing at the start of this, it won't fully answer your question, but the work of the PSB, if we just take the body as currently exists, which has been in place for... that's... for sort of just over 2 years, I think, since its inception. The PSB was created by the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, and its work for the beginning of its time has been on a number of issues. A lot of the work we're looking at here has been that issue of providing and producing the well-being assessment, understanding needs within the county and producing the plan to respond to that. Some of the decisions it will start to take now, so its decisions have largely been around production of evidence and the development of a plan. In future, as these pieces of work develop, it will be asked to take decisions on whether to progress them, whether to collectively resource some of those issues. What the PSB doesn't do is look at the entire breadth of everything which its constituent members look at. So there are certain services that we as a local authority deliver that don't touch the Public Service Board. Now, and similarly, there are services within health that don't touch it. I think the example you raised is a particularly pertinent one around what happened with the issue of the mental health ward in Chepstow, and I'm aware that that sort of played out in council and other committees, and rightly as members you've played a sort of the representative role there, but that isn't an issue which is particularly a PSB issue. It's an issue for Aneurin Bevan University Health Board, where there are issues which are complex and multi-agency. Quite rightly, those can be picked up by the Public Service Board.
Come back on that, Chairman, because you said that was an issue for the Health Board. Yes, the way they were going to deliver their service. They are part of a team, the Public Service Board, and I think that is critical that comes to that team as an item. That this is some proposal we are going to make. It doesn't have to be in the public forum, but certainly there needs to be the involvement of the other members. Because if that isn't part of the Public Service Board's consideration, I think that we might just as well scrap the idea, quite frankly.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Did you want to come back, Matt?
If I could just quickly, Chair, what it says, the Public Service Board has certain responsibilities. Aneurin Bevan University Health Board is also, as a single public body, bound by the Act. So in terms of how it must make its decisions, similarly, so when you sit down as representatives of Monmouthshire County Council's elected members, you make decisions and you look at evaluations of the impact of that decision in light of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So we have our single body responsibilities under the Act, as do the other public bodies in Wales. I think you rightly, as members, they're challenged whether in taking that decision, and Iron Bevan University Health Board had fully considered those issues. And I'm aware, I think, from memory, I know you were looking, and that was being scrutinised through Adults Select Committee, but we would expect to see, and you would rightly have grounds to look at the decisions of other public bodies and raise concerns about whether they were themselves acting in accordance with the principles of the Act.
I can, Chairman, if they don't bring those issues to the board to look at the whole and total picture for Monmouthshire, what is the point?
I think you raise a very important point, Councillor Smith, and I think also there's a much bigger discussion to have about health, which is probably the most important thing to our residents, apart from, you know, our well-being. It's a very important part, and yet we don't scrutinise it as a council, and I think there's increasingly becoming a case for us to scrutinise health. Hazel would just like to help me with this particular point as well.
Yes, the Adult Select Committee calls in the Health Board to discuss matters that affect people in Monmouthshire. We don't have the powers to scrutinise health that English authorities do. So your equivalent scrutiny committees in England have powers to require the attendance of health to their regular Adult Select equivalent scrutiny committee. In Wales, we don't have those powers, but we do have the power to scrutinise or review decisions or issues that affect any residents in Monmouthshire. So obviously, decisions taken by the Health Board will affect our residents. So we do call the Health Board to Adult Select and they do attend. Just to clarify on the former point around responsibilities of this Select, you do have the powers, and I've checked the legislation and I'll include it in the email to you, but you do have the power under paragraph 169 to require the attendance of partners, but only insofar as the exercise of their responsibilities in terms of a functioning PSB. So, for instance, you could look at the PSB wellbeing plan and you could ask whichever partner you would like to come and give an explanation to you in terms of the delivery of their part of the jigsaw puzzle in delivering that aspect of the plan. What you couldn't do in this select committee would be to require a partner to attend to discuss something that is outside of the PSB plan. So you do have powers to require attendance, but only insofar as the functions of the PSB in this select committee. But outside in the other select committees, you can request partners to attend to discuss anything that affects residents in Monmouthshire. That could be other services provided by other public bodies if it affects your residents. And whilst they might say that they can't definitely attend your meeting, you would be well within your responsibilities to put the invite there. Is that clear? Okay.
Thank you, Hazel. I mean, Councillor Smith, I share your frustration. I think the point that Councillor Smith is trying to make is that it was a fait accompli. We heard about this when really the decisions had been made and it wasn't given scrutiny by elected members.
Can you put up with me again, folks? The point I'm trying to make is that not bringing the people to scrutiny, but that within the Public Service Board, there should be good communication. As this is a proposal we may be bringing forward or whatever, I gave that as an example. I could give you another example, which basically I would have thought, well, if two members of that PSB actually talk to each other, they'd think this situation we're in is ridiculous, let's sort it. And I'm not aware of any discussion on that score going forward at all. So it's not a criticism, it is a criticism in a way. The health issue was purely given as an example, that I don't think communication within the PSB between the partners, unofficially, the communication is not as good, is not good enough to represent all the views and all the activities that are going on. So, not aiming at the health board, that was just an example. I can give you others where people, I think if that board talked to that association, we could get a better decision out of that or better working. And it is not, in my estimation, happening. I will now be quiet.
Thank you, Councillor Smith, and I'm sure that your points have been very carefully noted. Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like some clarification, really, because I'm slightly confused now about the wider role of the PSB. Is it the role of the PSB to develop the well-being objectives and then deliver them, or are the well-being objectives merely a small part of a broader role of the PSB? My understanding was that the work of the PSB was to develop the objectives and then to deliver them, whereas Councillor Smith is talking about something that's way beyond delivering the 4 objectives. And I'm slightly confused now as to what the actual role of the PSB is.
Thank you, Councillor Grocott. If we could have some clarification, please.
Thank you. Yes, PSB does have responsibility for developing the wellbeing plan and for delivering that wellbeing plan. And as part of that, they have to take into consideration some of the broader functions that they have as a PSB and as partners around that table. For example, there are other pieces of legislation and other things such as we have as statutory duties as a local authority that we have to deliver, and similar with our partner organisations that they have statutory duties that still exist and they still have to deliver those by whatever means they do as a public body. We do have there are other pieces of legislation, as I mentioned, that the PSB does have responsibility for overseeing. For example, violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence, the Act around that and how they're discharging that as a function. We have things such as the Crime and Disorder Act, which still sits solely with PSBs as their responsibility. So the legislative framework around PSBs can be a bit complicated. So there are some statutory duties that were placed on pre-existing partnerships prior to the legislation, and on public bodies rather, that still exist and still have to be discharged through the Public Services Board, because those statutory partners now are members of the Public Services Board. And what they challenge us to do is to look at those statutory functions. So, for example, if we're looking, as we've talked about, we'll keep it on the same theme, if that's okay, that if we're looking at adverse childhood experiences, a lot of the work around that will sit, some of it with our social care, which is why Charlotte was here earlier, but also with our police colleagues around the substance misuse issues, domestic violence issues, the criminal exploitation. All of those things are all captured within the Crime and Disorder Act, which is still a statutory function that the PSB has to discharge. So what we try to do is look at how can we bring these things together so we're not having a plan over here for how we're discharging that and then a wellbeing plan over here which we're discharging separately, but recognising that these things are interrelated, and as public bodies we should be looking at how those factors come into play when we're looking at what we're trying to achieve through the wellbeing plan. I'm not sure if I've confused things even further, or if that's given a bit of an example that it is a complex landscape the PSBs are dealing with, but it does mean that there are other considerations that they will need to give consideration to as part of what they're doing through the wellbeing plan, I suppose is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Councillor
I understand totally, Sharon. And I can see that legislation like the Crime and Disorder Act will directly impinge on some of the objectives that we're working towards. But from your answer, am I right then in thinking that actually the decision by the Health Board to close a ward would not be part of the broader considerations of the PSB? I fail to see the link between what Councillor Smith is talking about and the responsibilities of the PSB. I think part of what public bodies have is we have our own duties as a public body to give due consideration, as Matt has said, to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So decisions that we take as a public body in our own right, we should be considering how those decisions are thought through, if you like, in terms of the well-being of future generations. Similarly, that does also apply to all the other public bodies on the PSB, particularly Health, who are one of the statutory partners. I don't feel I'm in a position to comment on the ward closure that you're talking about.
But really, similarly, as a public body, they would have to challenge themselves in terms of the legislation, and when they make that decision as a public body in a similar way that we make decisions as a local authority. I suppose in hindsight, it's something that maybe we could have explored as partners, but really speaking, these are issues, and I think that public bodies, when they come together, should be considering how this plays out for each one of them and what their role is, and the bit that we talked about earlier when we were looking at systems and how organisations operate. What are the interdependencies? So we now have to start to be more astute at thinking a decision that we make as a local authority will have an impact potentially on police or on fire or on health boards. And similarly, they should be thinking in a similar way. And that's really the way that we should start to change the culture within organisations. So I hope that.
Thank you. And it does seem, sort of wrapping that point up, that we can only operate within a certain framework. And I think as councillors, we've got to be very diligent on the ground when we hear things that are happening in our communities, so that we can bring these people to account at this committee, because really the way things are set up, it's not really always on our side, and that was an example with that particular case that you raised, where it came to us far too late, really. And until we get the same scrutiny opportunities as they've got in England, I really don't think that's going to change, unfortunately. Yes, Hazel.
I don't think we should get too hung up on the fact that we can't require partners to attend our normal scrutiny committees, because I've not experienced ever asking a partner to attend and them failing to actually attend. It is difficult when you're asking chief executives and so forth to come to scrutiny, but we've never been refused any invitation to attend scrutiny. They've been very willing to come and talk to us and engage with us, but the committee, particularly Adult Select, is building quite a strong relationship now with the Health Board in terms of forward work planning, particularly with the new hospital. There's been lots of discussions there, and we've been scrutinising the Health Board for at least 6 years. So I think for going from nothing, where there isn't actually a duty for us to scrutinise them, to having regular meetings where they want to discuss proposals with us, I think we have moved some way forward. But we need to start thinking wider now in terms of looking at specific issues, identifying who partners would be, whether they're internal, external, and inviting the relevant stakeholders when you're scrutinising a particular issue. But I wouldn't get too hung up on your responsibilities in terms of requiring people to attend, because it's not actually been an issue in my experience here.
Thank you very much. And did we have any more questions? Councillor Chauhan, did you have any questions at all? There's just, thank you. Just a bit of clarification I'd like. There's a point made about intergenerational living and about learning from good practice elsewhere. I mean, certainly, I'm sure other councillors would agree to me, when we go around knocking on doors, it's an absolute eye-opener how many people are living on their own, and this seems to be actually increasing. And this is far-reaching. We've got a step here, say, about redressing the housing stock, and it was my understanding that we were actually looking to have more smaller units in future housing stock. And then in that next bit, we've got intergenerational living. Can you just explain to me what we mean by that and how that's all going to work?
I have to say I'm probably not the best person to explain it. So the intergenerational living one, I think, is being led by MHA and Mellin. So just confirm that one. So what we're looking at there, I think, obviously you have the intergenerational living. You might think in terms of multiple families living within a single household, multiple generations. A lot of the intergenerational living projects, I think, that people look at are where you have sort of mixed use sites of the type that we saw. There was a television program on earlier in the week, and it showed the benefit of older people in their 80s and 90s get from living alongside young children and young families and the health benefits of that. So I think it's exploring some of the practice in that space. But probably, it's about that point that my level of knowledge stops. So in this field, I'm an interested amateur rather than a professional expert. And I think perhaps that's something we could ask the ask the experts at MHA Mellon and also the housing team here in Monmouthshire to give a little more detail to enhance the knowledge there of what that is and exactly what it can achieve in terms of health and other positive benefits.
Thank you. And I certainly would like to have the housing officers back, because I think that we're making some far-reaching statements here, but we really need, as elected members, to know exactly what they mean. I know this is objectives looking ahead for many years. I think it's 30 years ahead that we're looking at here. And I think it's obviously a very good idea, because Councillor Grocott alluded to the fact that, our communities are disappearing and we're fast becoming, a commuter belt for some of the larger cities, and we're losing this sense of community that we used to have. So I'd be very interested, in fact, to see how this is all going to join up, because that's quite radical, given that all that we've been hearing is that we're going to be building sort of smaller houses and more compact properties. So I'd be interested to know how that's going to work. Are there any other? Councillor Smith?
My understanding of sort of one of the intergenerational ones was actually perhaps youngsters moving into very large houses and actually living with a mature person. But you've got to have all sorts of checks and balances for that, and incredible. What I would like, I am very, very aware within my own community of the volume of empty housing that exists, and that really it would be very good to see the council addressing that in a meaningful way. I think we could achieve results there.
Yes, thank you. And I think that housing is something we're going to have to revisit, because it's such an important topic. And although we've had some special committees, haven't we, in economy and development, we really need to look ahead and see how this is all going to work. So I would really like to have a little bit more meat on the bones as far as those steps are concerned at a future. Yes, okay. Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Jay. Just to add slightly to that, I think it would be good to have a specific input from housing. We are looking now to redevelop the LDP, and looking at the well-being objective here, responding to the challenges associated with demographic change. The very first item there is readdress the supply and mix of housing stock to ensure suitable and affordable housing is available to all demographic groups. And I think it's something this council is currently failing to do. And so I think that would be an excellent area that we could explore and make a contribution perhaps to the development of the new LDP.
Thank you. I think we're all agreed on that. So that needs to be put forward as a recommendation from the committee. Are there any other comments on the agenda item number 5? So I think I'd like to thank the officers for presenting this item. We've had a good debate about it, and I think obviously it's something we're going to be revisiting in the future. And we're all very aware of how we have to look at every single piece of documentation that comes out from the council, that the wellbeing objectives are on there, which we're all now looking closely at. So, it's good to see that this is progressing and we're making progress.
Can I just check, Chair, then, as a sort of outcome of this scrutiny, you'd like to look at the wellbeing objective in terms of responding to challenges associated with demographic change, and perhaps invite partners in to discuss future supply of housing and intergenerational living, a better understanding of that?
I think it's important we do that. I think we should take guidance perhaps from Matt about the best time to do that. Because I do think we could have an influence on our own LDP as well as the wider responsibilities towards the PSB. But on the other hand, if there's absolutely nothing they could come and report to us, there's no point in that. So I think we should take Matt's guidance, really.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, and Sharon, please come in on this as well. Certainly, I think the intergenerational living one is at a very early stage of development. So there's, at this point in time, if I were to say, if the next meeting was in 2 weeks' time, I'd say it's probably too early. I think we'll go away and have a chat to those partners and assess the stage they are at as to whether in 3 months' time it's a good time to get in there. Because you're quite right. Sometimes it's really good to have the discussion early on where the thinking is unformed and it can be influenced and directed, you know, as part of the sort of, you know, the sort of policy development aspect of it. At the same time, you need enough information to be able to have a discussion and a debate around it. So I think with both of those, what we'll do, if possible, go away, check with the lead officers, and be in touch with you in the coming weeks as to whether those are sort of viable propositions for the committee and the timing would be right.
Thank you. And I think that you make a good point, Councillor Grocott. I mean, we're trying to get the LDP wrapped up a lot more quickly than we did previously. So time isn't on our side, and this is a critical part of it. So I think we want that message to go back, and as soon as you can, to come back to us. Thank you. So unless there's any other points anybody would like to make, I think we've covered the recommendation. And, you know, we've carefully scrutinised this, and we look forward to, obviously, seeing some of those items back in future. So I think we'll now move on to agenda item 7, which is the regional project work, and who's presenting this. So it's Richard, isn't it? Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Here just to give you an update to help you understand about how regional working is helping contribute to the Public Service Board's delivery of the Act. I'll kick off and run you through some of the projects I've been involved in. I'll also then hand over to Hazel, who will particularly look at the Climate Ready Gwent project, which is in the paper. The paper today really brings you up to speed, building on the update I gave you at the last committee meeting, so I'll run through it fairly briefly. Welsh Government have made available funding for the 5 PSBs in Gwent to build on work completed as part of their wellbeing assessment and to help build towards the development of their wellbeing plan. And that funding was available in 2017-18 and is also funding now available in this year in 2018-19. And representatives of those 5 PSBs through what's called the Gwent-wide Strategic Wellbeing Assessment Group, shortened to GSWAG, have been developing and implementing projects to support the development of those wellbeing plans. So the 2 projects I'll talk about, one is the Future Trends project. So the project was, reports on the projects were initially completed last year, and those were 2 main parts to those reports. One was the Horizon Scan, which looked at treating important trends, disruptors and drivers of change to provide a valuable evidence base for public service boards on what potential future trends there may be that they need to take account of in their planning. And the second part of that was a scenarios report, which looked at an approach which will help PSBs start to think about those trends when developing and implementing their wellbeing plans. So the next stage of that work, using that really valuable evidence base we've now got as PSBs in Gwent, is to bring together a conference which has been planned for November to share some of those key messages from those reports with PSB partners from across Gwent. And bearing in mind that some of the issues in those future trends, some will be very local, but some will be more regional, national and even global trends, bringing together those 5 PSBs, hopefully develop some common understanding of those and be really beneficial to start to embed and develop the outputs of the report we had last year in more detail. And then following that conference, individual workshops being planned in each of the 5 PSB areas. So there will be a workshop in Monmouthshire that will delve into the detail from the reports and conference even further and allow us to particularly look at that into the lens of our wellbeing plan which the Public Service Board has developed. So we're talking about in the previous item, for example, the steps that you were looking at. So actually looking at applying some of those lenses of what may happen in the future to those steps to make sure that we're future-proofing what we're looking to implement. So that'll be really beneficial to us and work that certainly those step leads will be looking to take on board in that workshop and the arrangements for that, practicalities that are just being worked through at the moment. A second part, which I'll touch upon, is the Happy Communities set of tools, which we used in 2017-18. The first part of those was an index, which looked at broad indicators that are a good measure of well-being, which was based on work developed through Gwent. Has now been taken forward by Data Cymru and published at all Wales level in terms of thriving places, Wales as it's called. So there's a range of indicators there. And the second part of that work was happiness pulse measurement. And that looked at a measurement of individual well-being. So it was a survey undertaken by our residents, which gave them a better understanding about their own well-being and some hints and tips about how they could improve it in future. And also from a public service board, that started to give us understanding about people, further understanding, I should say, about what people were saying about their own individual well-being. And at this stage, we're currently looking at analysing those results we've had back in a bit further detail, taking some of the data we've now got and try and translate that, what that means in terms of information, and then using that as a sort of evaluation about how we may take forward that project in future. That's the two I've been involved in, and with Hazel talk about the Climate Ready Gwent.
One of the pieces of work that the Gwent group has done is look at all the different wellbeing plans from the 5 different areas and pick out kind of common themes that have cropped up in each of the wellbeing plans, and think about ways that joint work could be done to tackle some of those common themes. And climate change is one of those topics. Each authority had got something in there about building resilient communities and resilient environments to climate change, and also mitigating climate change. So reducing how we contribute to climate change, but also being prepared for it and being resilient. And this piece of work, one of the things about something that's as big as climate change is it can be quite hard to kind of get your head around, and you're often presented with lots of graphs and bar charts showing carbon dioxide levels and temperature and things like that. But that doesn't really kind of make it real for people. But actually, if you talk to people who've had their home flooded or, you know, suffered from heat stroke during the drought we had earlier this year, or the men who go out doing the sandbagging, how often they have to do that now and how more frequent it is. When you actually start to talk to people who've been impacted by climate change, suddenly it becomes a lot more real, and it becomes something that people can relate to for where they live and their locality, rather than something that's a little bit abstract and, you know, hard to see how it relates to us. So the idea of this project is to gather from across Gwent people's kind of stories, really, people's experiences of the impacts of climate change. You know, we've already seen, take this year, for example, we had terribly cold weather and lots of snow in March. And by kind of May, we're in the middle of a heat wave that lasted several months. You know, rainfall levels were really low. Farmers were struggling. You know, then there's been some real big storms following that. Today, we're meant to have the hottest day in October ever. You know, even just when you look at this year, you can see the impacts that climate change is happening on our communities. So we're trying to capture stories from a whole cross-section of different types of people and different types of kind of climate events or weather events that they've tackled, that they've experienced. And then to kind of use those stories in a kind of creative way to produce, and we don't know the detail of what it will be yet, because it depends on how the kind of artistic graphic people who are going to be working with us on this decide the best way to do it. But rather than just a big fat report coming out of it, something actual visual, something that people can see and relate to and understand, so that can go to all the PSB partners and people can easily see it, understand it, relate to it, and see what they can be doing in their own organisations to better respond to the challenges that climate change brings. So that's the idea of the project. I think it's quite an exciting project. A consultant has been appointed to do that. He's going to be going out and doing community engagement, gathering those stories from around communities. We're meeting with him next week to kind of scope that out a bit more. And yeah, I look forward to seeing the kind of results, but I think it will be good to have something that's not just a big fat report of graphs. That's important too, but actually understanding how climate change is affecting people here and now in our communities, I think is going to be really useful to help inform then the policies that we make as our organisations.
Thank you very much indeed, and that's certainly some very interesting topics to discuss there. So can I ask members for questions on this item? Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. Some interesting, potentially quite exciting stuff here. And I think the example Hazel just gave us, it certainly caught my imagination. And yeah, I think there's some really good work that could be done there. A couple of considerations, really. The first is that it's later on today, I'm going to be attending the Education Achievement Service, which, of course, is a pan-Gwent organisation. I've heard Hazel now just mention the word Gwent again. And it's about this apparent move to an ever greater degree of inter-authority working. And in other venues here, I've spoken of my own personal belief that is something that should be encouraged wherever we can. But then again, I'm biased because I used to work for Gwent. But I mean, just looking back to those days, again, thinking in terms of early childhood experience. I remember in Gwent days, safeguarding was obviously a whole authority responsibility. And when it broke into 5 new unitary authorities, each of those authorities said, that's our responsibility, we're going to do it. And so in those days, there was what was then called the Area Child Protection Committee. It's morphed since then. But there were then 5 Area Child Protection Committees, and the scoundrels who were out there simply moved from borough to borough to escape any ability to look at what they were doing. We now have a South East Wales child protection organisation. And I think this is another example where we can work more effectively with collaboration between the authorities in South East Wales. Now, my questions really are, the present initiatives have been largely supported by seed funding from the Welsh Government. And I want to know if there is an officer commitment as well as a political one, that should continue and develop into the future. Do officers share my view that working in a bigger organisation is likely to have more effect? And then related to that, a second question is, having said that we work better together, I am very aware that Monmouthshire has a very different socio-economic picture to the other authorities of the old Gwent. And I would simply want to know if the other authorities are as keen to work with Monmouthshire, bearing in mind that we are in many ways very different.
Thank you, Councillor Grocott. There's 2 questions there around collaboration and the difference in the socio-economic position of Monmouth compared to the other counties.
You're exactly right. You know, some things it really makes sense to collaborate on. And the example I talked about, climate change, it doesn't stop at boundaries. And, you know, people who live in Torfaen commute through Monmouthshire and, you know, we are bigger than just Monmouthshire. But there's also very unique challenges that Monmouthshire faces that some of the other areas don't. So I think really the kind of officer view is it depends what the issue is. And, you know, there are certain parts of our wellbeing plan that are quite unique to Monmouthshire and sort of challenges that we face. Perhaps if you think about transport and the rural transport issues, they're particularly pertinent in Monmouthshire because we're a large rural county, so we're tackling that locally. But that said, we're also working collaboratively with some of the other Gwent authorities in terms of we're about to commission a feasibility study into electric vehicle charging points across the whole of the Gwent area, and also involving other partners like the police and fire and rescue and the health board, because it doesn't make sense for Monmouthshire to have its own sort of charging system, and then you go over the border to Torvine and it's a different setup and different equipment and things. So you know, where it makes sense to work collaboratively, I think officers are very up for that, and we can pool limited resources and get more bang for our buck by working together. But also recognising that there are unique issues in Monmouthshire that only probably our PSB will be able to tackle and be interested in, perhaps because they're quite unique to Monmouthshire. So I think officers are generally up for working collaboratively. You know, the more people working on something together, the more we can achieve than just our own limited resources, but also recognising our local issues that perhaps aren't relevant for other parts of Gwent.
Are you happy with that response, Councillor Grocott? Any other questions from members? No? Can I just ask a couple of my own then? I remember doing this happiness survey, and I just wondered... I was at the time. If I'd had it today with my cold, I might not have been. But I'm just interested to know, you know, are we reaching out to the people who perhaps aren't unhappy? And what was the take-up? We may have been given the figures previously of the happiness survey, but do we have a figure for how many people actually took part in that survey? And secondly, it seems that this scenarios report is a pretty critical report, and I'd just like to ask, have any members seen this report? No? Is it, can you send us the link so that we can read this report? Because it seems to be quite critical, really, for all of us thinking ahead. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so to pick up on the response rates to the happiness pulse. I know we had quite a detailed discussion about that last time. So it's 1,100 residents completed it, and also around 400 Monmouthshire County Council staff completed it as well. And as part of that, as part of the engagement around actually encouraging people to complete it, we tried to make sure that we covered a broader range of people as possible to make sure we're trying to pick up a representative sample across Monmouthshire. We had a discussion last time about 1,000 residents being, you know, a small population compared to the total population in Monmouthshire. But what we did do is try and work hard to engage people in existing groups and forums which we already had. So we went, for example, to the Engaged Change group, the Action 50 Plus forums, try and make sure where we could, we were using what we had, limited resources we had, to promote that survey, to target people as strongly as we could around that. The second point around the futures work, absolutely, that is a really important evidence base now for the Public Service Board and partners to take account of when taking forward the steps. And I think what we're keen to do is to help them understand further about how that can be applied through the conference and workshops, which I talked about as well. So taking that really vast, and it's quite vast amount of information and intelligence we've now got, and translating that into action. And so hopefully that conference and that workshop will support that. And it could be something we consider. Obviously, we mentioned earlier, members of this committee may have a particular view in that as part of your role, and it could be something you actually look to participate in some of those. You get that better understanding, and surely probably more articulately than I could describe some of the outcomes of that work. So you help get that understanding of that and how the Public Service Board is using it as well. And get some nods from beside me, so I think that might be a logical step.
Thank you. So would everybody like to see that scenarios report? Or if you could give us a précis of it, because it's quite difficult struggling through. Yes, that's right. But thank you very much for that. I mean, it puts everything into context, and I mean, I think it's going to be even more important in future, given the settlements that all of the councils across Wales, and I think there's all councils, and it doesn't matter what political party you are really struggling with the settlements, and it's going to be even more important that we're working together as much as we can in the future. So unless there's any other comments anybody would like to ask. I'd like to thank officers for presenting that final agenda item. And we now move on to look at the minutes of the last meeting held on the 4th of July.
Minutes just provided for accuracy, Chair, rather than discussion.
Are you happy that those minutes are moved?
Yeah, I think they're accurate and I'll move them.
Thank you. And if we can now consider the Select Committee's Forward Work Programme, we've obviously had some suggestions today for items on that.
Yes, I think I need to sit down with Matthew and colleagues and work out timescales for some of the items that we've suggested today. We also need to scope the Forward Work Programme a little bit further in advance and look at some key milestones to programme in dates-wise. So if you can leave that with me, thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for attending, both members and officers. Although we were thin on the ground members-wise, it hasn't stifled our debate. And I would like to thank members for their very valuable contributions and for officers for the reports that have been presented to us, and also to our officers at the front that have helped us with the meeting. So thank you all very much, and the meeting is now closed.